Open your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms this morning. I want to bring just a brief message, I believe. Every time I say a brief message, my kids get nervous, but a brief message. Live a marked life. Live a marked life. And the theme of this is thankfulness and praise. But I just want to ask this question as we turn to Psalms rather. Psalms. I think I said, what psalm did I say? I told you the wrong psalm. Psalm 9 is where I want you to be this morning. Psalm 9. Psalm 9 this morning. Lucas, can you turn up the white microphone? Make sure that's unmuted. I don't think I'm muted, but turn it up just a little bit for me, please. Psalm 9. I'm going to go ahead and read the first part of this chapter. I invite you to read the first several verses with me. I'll eventually read the whole chapter. Thank you, Lucas. But begin in verse 1, Psalm 9. I will praise thee, O Lord, with my whole heart. I will show forth all thy wonderful works. I will be glad and rejoice in thee. I will sing praise to thy name, O thou most high. When mine enemies are turned back, they shall fall and perish at thy presence. For thou hast maintained my right and my cause. Thou sattest in the throne, judging right. Thou hast rebuked the heathen. Thou hast destroyed the wicked. Thou hast put out their name forever and ever. O thou enemy, destructions are come to a perpetual end, and thou hast destroyed cities. Their memorial is perished with thee. But the Lord shall endure forever. He hath prepared his throne for judgment, and he shall judge the world in righteousness. He shall minister judgment to the people of uprightness. I want to bring this message, really a Thanksgiving message, but live a marked life. What is your life marked by? That's what I want you to think about this morning. What marks your life? If somebody were to describe you, how would they describe you? Not out of any animosity or not out of any fluff piece of just trying to be nice to you, but when they think of you, what do they think of? What marks your life? And as we think about this, now again, just for a moment, you can probably think of some people that you say, well, okay, so this person is marked by joy. Right? I think we've all known somebody that just seems to have a joyful attitude. No matter what happens, no matter where they go, no matter what takes place, they just have a smile and a joy. There was a girl in my high school that we used to call her Smiles, because everywhere she went, she had a smile. Now, at the same time, that person that you say, well, that person's marked by joy, sometimes they're masking things. Sometimes it could be they're hiding something. And the truth will eventually be known, but there are people that are generally joyful, cheerful, positive people. There's also people probably we could look around, or we could say, I know people that nothing ever goes right for them. Never know somebody like that? No matter what happens, there's always something to complain about, right? I've known a few people like that in my life. No matter what takes place, it wasn't the way they wanted it, or it wasn't how it was last year, or it wasn't the way it was supposed to be, or they can find something to complain about everything. There are some people that are just down in the dumps all the time. And I'm not putting that down. I'm just simply saying we know people who say that person just seems, they're marked by discouragement. There are some people that we'd say are marked by thankfulness. They're a genuinely appreciative person. And I think that's kind of the thought of Thanksgiving, is that we would give thanks. One of the things that I'm going to start doing, I've not been posting a whole lot on Facebook and social media lately, but I want to get back to posting some things that I'm going to post something to be thankful for every day from now until, or from starting Monday until the end of the year, something to be thankful for, because we've entered now with Thanksgiving and now with Christmas what's supposed to be a time of thankfulness and joy and celebration. And I think so much we need to be reminded of that, because as we look around us, we see so much to complain about in 2020. This has been a year like none other, hasn't it? In so many ways. I mean, we can talk about COVID, but not just the COVID, because people say, well, I've never had COVID. I don't know anybody that's got COVID. I think most of us by now probably know somebody, but not just that, but because of things being shut down or because of businesses closing or not being able to go to work, we often get focused on ourselves and our own reality. But I was talking to somebody the other day about how they've worked, and in fact, Landon, not who I was referring to, but I'll just mention this, has worked so little because of business being down, and then they're trying to give some of the adults, the people that have families, some of the hours that normally he might get, and so it's affecting him. But there are others, that restaurant business in particular, and stores in particular, where not even so much around here as much perhaps, but in other places where they're more restrictive and they've closed things down to the point where people are really struggling. And there are people that, are out of work, or there are people that are struggling with finances, or they're struggling with health things. And I already mentioned this, but the fact that when you get even just a little tickle in your throat or a little cold and you wonder, could it be COVID? Could it be that? And it's really impacted our year. I mentioned last week, and I'm not going to go back through this, but some of the things we've been through as far as Landon having appendicitis and Landon having some stomach problems, and then Tracy's had a year of where she's had several bouts with colds and viruses and sickness, being back in teaching 4K, where she's around let's just put it this way. 4-year-olds tend to not use tissues like they're supposed to, right? And they wipe it on their shirt, or they wipe it on her, or they wipe it on the wall, or whatever it is they wipe it on, and just more germs around than what she's used to. And so it's been a year of adjustment for her. Many of you have had family, friends, if not yourselves. I was mentioning the other day, I don't know of anybody in our church proper that I know of that has had COVID, or at least that I know of that's had COVID, but I think many of us have had family members impacted, deaths, sickness, hospital stints, where people have been really struggling with this. It's been a year that we could say, this is a year to complain about. But can I just remind you of how much we have to be thankful for? How much we have to be praiseworthy for? Here was David giving a psalm. And if you go back to Psalm 7, which I started out in my reading as I was preparing for this week, Psalm 7 was where he was being lied about to Saul. David was. And his enemies were telling lies about him and untruths about him, and talking about how he was being hunted like an animal. And here we get now to Psalm 9 in this trilogy of Psalms, if you will. And here's David saying, despite all that, despite the fact that my life has been in danger, despite the fact that I'm being lied about, despite the fact that I'm being pursued, I will give praise and thanks. And I think that's the attitude that we have to have. But what is your life marked with? And how do you mark your life with the right things? How do you mark your life with the right things? I want you to see, number one, I want you to see a testimony of the individual. And these first 8 verses that I read is really the testimony of David. It's the testimony of where God personally has been there for him and delivered him. It's a testimony of how God has taken care of him. And his life is marked by thankfulness. By thankfulness. We see, I will praise thee. Now, in some translations, that word there is put, I will thank thee. But the idea is the same. Whether you use praise or thank, the idea is the same. Because I will praise thee, O Lord, with my whole heart. I will show forth thy marvelous works, and I will sing and praise thy name in verse 2. In other words, I'm giving you the credit, but I'm showing my appreciation for you. In a world where I was reading just the other day, and I was reading again this morning, where depression, they say, has increased as much, as far as people that feel like they're under depression, has increased as much as 300% in clinical depression because of 2020, because of things that are going on, because of having to be socially distant. I think it's so important that we realize how important personal interaction is. It's no surprise or no shock to me that depression and even suicide rates are going up this year, not just because of the sickness, but because of the effects of the COVID-19, as far as having to be isolated. We think of, I was just listening to Mary Ann just a minute ago talking about Doug and how they can't go see Doug, and they're hoping to just video chat with Doug just to see him. Can you imagine being in a nursing home and not being able to be around really anybody? But even how in certain states, Thanksgiving, they were talking about how you weren't allowed to have more than a certain number in your home, and how during this time of year, it can be depressing in of itself when we think of who's not at the table, but when we can't be around other family, other friends to get the support and that personal touch and the love that we so desperately as human beings need. Depression and discouragement can be rampant. But I think one of the remedies for discouragement is praising the Lord, giving thanks to Him. And that's what David was doing here. I will praise the Lord. His life was marked by praise. You know, David was known as, by God, God said that he was what? A man after my own heart, right? And some say, well, that might be what marks David. But I think if you look at David, and you could, listen, if you want to be negative, you could say, well, he committed adultery, he committed murder. Maybe his life was marked by bravery. But I think if you read the Psalms and you read the story of David, you see a life that was marked by thankfulness and also marked by praise. That's what we're seeing here. I will praise thee, O Lord. I'm going to praise you, God. I'm going to praise you. Listen, he said, I'm not going to praise you with my lips. It's easy to come in here. And when it's easy to go into a church or go into anywhere, and you have, especially when you have professional, beautiful music and everything goes the way it's supposed to go, it's easy to get up and sing. It's a little harder when you come in and you don't feel so good. It's a little harder when you come in and things don't go quite the way you'd planned them. It's a little harder when you come in and maybe you can get it out with your mouth, but is your heart also singing those words? David said, I'm going to praise you not just with my mouth. I'm going to praise you with my whole heart. In other words, my whole life, I'm going to praise you. I'm going to thank you. And so David's life was marked by thankfulness. It was marked by praise. And he didn't say, I'm just going to keep it to myself. You hear me say this a lot, and I'm going to say it again. I know that there are sometimes we say, well, these things are personal or these things are private, and we don't declare them. And I know that sometimes when we do, we sometimes get accused of bragging about what God is doing or bragging about how things are going in our life. But I look in my Bible and I see people that are openly declaring the goodness of God. And by the way, if you read this, David's not declaring his own personal luck. He's not declaring his own personal good fortune. He's not declaring his own personal circumstances, because his circumstances were not that. But he's declaring the goodness of his God. I will be glad and rejoice, not in the fact that I won the lottery, not in the fact that I got a new job, not in the fact that I'm of good health, not in the fact that I've got family that loves me. I'm sure he did praise the Lord for those things as far as family that loves him and so forth and so on. But I'm rejoicing in you. I'm going to sing your name, O thou Most High. David not only was marked by thankfulness and marked by praise, but David was also marked by victory. Marked by victory. When mine enemies are turned back, they shall fall and perish at thy presence. David's life was marked by victory. David was victorious over the lion and the bear, right? When he was a shepherd. David was victorious, you could say, when he was anointed to be the next king of Israel. David was victorious when he took the stone and the sling and he slew the giant Goliath. And David was victorious with his band of mighty men before he became king in avoiding the traps and the pursuit of King Saul, but also when he was in battle. David was victorious. His life was marked by victory. But his life was also marked by grace. One of the most beautiful thoughts to me in this whole chapter is verse 4. Look at verse 4 with me. For thou hast maintained my right and my cause. Thou sattest in the throne, judging right. David wasn't saying sometimes, God, sometimes things go the way I want them to go, or sometimes things I praise you, or sometimes you do things that are praiseworthy. He says, you're maintaining me. And it's grace, by grace, that God does that for David. David didn't deserve for God to maintain him. We already talked about this just briefly, but David was a murderer. David was an adulterer. David was somebody who failed many times. David was a failed parent in many aspects we can look at, and yet he's saying, God, you maintained my right and my cause. In other words, you sustained them. You maintained them. It was an even flow. Always marked by grace. But the most important thing I want you to see, and then I'm going to look at how it applies to us, is he was marked not so much by a thing, but by a presence. And if I could say something to you today, if you want to find the key to what ought to mark you, or again, the key to being marked by these things is acknowledging God, declaring God, looking to God, praising God. That's the key to defeating the discouragement and depression and keeping your eyes on Him. That is a key. But the key is this. It's not so much that, yes, he was thankful, and yes, he was praising, and yes, he was victorious, and yes, he did observe, or he had grace shown to his life. But it was the presence of God that marked his life. And the presence of God ought to mark your life and my life. It was God's presence that was there at all times. Look, if you would, and it says, but the Lord shall endure forever. He hath prepared his throne for judgment, and he shall judge the world in righteousness. He shall minister judgment to the people in uprightness. And then also, if you go down to verse 9, the Lord will be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. It's the presence of God that ought to mark your life. And while if we were just to say, okay, what marks this person's life or what marks that person's life, we might say, well, joy or giving or selflessness or whatever. But really what I want to mark my life and what you ought to have marked your life or allow to mark your life is God's presence in your life. That people would say, listen, I don't know what it is, but I do know this. That person's a blessed person. That person declares the glory of God. You might say to me this morning, well, preacher, that was David. And David was a man after God's own heart, and David was an example in the Bible, and David was a king, and David was a warrior. And David was used by God in many ways, but what about me? What about me? Well, all these things I think apply to you, and I'm going to show you that because look, if you would, as we read the rest of this chapter. Beginning in verse 9, the Lord also, now that word is key there. Furthermore, so in other words, David's saying, listen, God has been all these things to me, but the Lord also will be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. And they that know thy name will put their trust in thee. For thou, Lord, hast not forsaken them that seek thee. Sing praises to the Lord which dwelleth in Zion. Declare among the people his doings. When he maketh inquisition for blood, he remembereth them. He forgetteth not the cry of the humble. Have mercy upon me, O Lord. Consider my trouble which I suffer of them that hate me, and thou that liftest me up from the gates of death, that I may show forth all thy praise in the gates of the daughter of Zion. I will rejoice in thy salvation. The heathen are sunk down in the pit that they had made, in the net which they hid as their own foot taken. The Lord is known by the judgment which he executeth. The wicked is snared in the work of his own hands. Higgaion, Selah. The wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. For the needy shall not always be forgotten. The expectation of the poor shall not perish forever. Arise, O Lord, let not man prevail. Let the heathen be judged in thy sight. Put them in fear, O Lord, that the nations may know themselves to be but men. And the thing I want to focus on is this. We saw the testimony of the individual, but I want you to see the promise for the people. It wasn't just for individuals. It wasn't just for David or for Gideon or for Daniel or for Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. It wasn't just for Moses or Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. It wasn't just for people like Joseph. It wasn't just for, even people like Samson. It wasn't just for Ezra's or the Nehemiahs. It wasn't just for the Peter, the James, and the Johns. It wasn't just for the Pauls and the Andrews or the Timothys. But it's for you and me. If your faith is in God, then God can mark your life and mark your life for the same things that we just talked about for David. Just in this chapter we see this. The Lord will also be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble, that they that know thy name. Do you know God's name? Do you belong to him? Are you his child? Have you put your faith in the Son of God who died on a cross for you? Have you put your faith in the God above who sent his Son to die on a cross and pay the price of your sin? Then that's who we're talking about here. All who will put their trust in him. I think the word here is key when he says, all they that know thy name will put their trust. So those that belong to God will put their trust. And you say, well, I know God, but sometimes I'm still discouraged, or I don't sense these things or feel these things. I'll just remind you, whether you sense them or feel them or not, God is maintaining and God is sustaining you and me. But also the fact is that when your trust is in him. Now you say, well, wait a minute, I have to trust him to be saved. Yes. But also sometimes we may put our faith and our trust in him for salvation, but there's times that our faith and our trust wane and we struggle. But when you're looking to him and you're trusting him and God gives you the strength to open your eyes and see what he's doing, or to look to him and just trust him, oh, you're able to praise. Oh, you're able to give thanks. Oh, you're able to be victorious. Oh, you're able to understand the grace that is in your life, because the presence of God is in your life. It says he's a personal refuge. Now, use the word refuge there twice in verse 9. The Lord also will be a refuge for the oppressed and a refuge in times of trouble. The first refuge there is talking about a high place. In other words, the ones that are oppressed or being held down, he will lift up. You ever felt like life just weighs you down? You ever felt that way? You ever felt like somebody is holding you down? Maybe it's an enemy, maybe it's an election, maybe it's politics, maybe it's a job, maybe it's an employer, maybe it's someone in your family, maybe it's a friend or a neighbor or anybody. Somebody's just keeping me back, they're holding me down. God says, listen, I will lift you up. I will hold you up. But also he says, not just that, but I'll also be a refuge or a fortress. So not only is it on a high place, but it's an impenetrable fortress of protection in a high place. Oh, the beauty of what God does for us. And he is a personal refuge, but also he's a granter of mercy. We can praise and thank him, and we can understand his presence because he grants mercy on us. Verse 13, he's saying, have mercy upon me, O Lord. Consider my trouble. which I suffer of them that hate me, thou that liftest me up from the gates of death. In other words, he's putting his faith in him. He says, listen, you've done it before. You're going to do it again. Show mercy on me. And God does show mercy. I'm so thankful for the mercy that he shows me. I'm so thankful for the mercy that he shows my family. I'm so thankful for the mercy that he shows us. That God is a merciful God. God didn't just squash me flat the first time I messed up in my life. God didn't squash me flat when I messed up this morning. God didn't squash me flat when we butchered a song, or I butchered us by having the wrong words on the screen. God didn't squash us. When we make mistakes, God shows us mercy. God is understanding. He's also an avenger who will not fail. An avenger who will not fail. My youngest son, both my sons, but my youngest son in particular has really kind of gotten into the avenger thing as far as the movies. And in the Avenger movies, if you've never seen them, you don't know what I'm talking about. They're superheroes, right? They got supernatural powers, and they've got abilities, and they all these things. But there's times in the movies that they fail. They're there to defend the people. They're there to fight for the universe, and so forth and so on in these movies. But in the movies, and in fact, in the next to last movie, it ends with them failing. You say, well, what's your point, preacher? Talking about a movie. Because God never does. God never does. He's an avenger that, listen, we don't have to seek our own retribution. We don't have to seek vengeance against our enemies or people we consider our enemies. God will always deliver. God will always grant the victory. God will always have the victory. Oh, even when we don't realize it, even when we don't sense it, even when we don't feel it, even in the moment when we think that we're losing the battle, and there's times as Christians we look and say, it doesn't seem like we're winning the war, but we are. Verse 17, the wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. For the needy shall not always be forgotten. The expectation of the poor shall not perish forever. Arise, O Lord. Let not man prevail. Now the idea is there is not that, the man is going to prevail and don't let it happen. The idea is, God, I know that you're not going to let man prevail. I know that you're going to have the victory. And we can look to God in the same way. I know, God, that you're going to have the victory. And he is the avenger that will not fail, but he's a conqueror that gives the victory. Let your life be marked in such a way that people can only want to know what it is that really is marking your life. It's an indescribable quality. And what it really is, it's the presence and the person of God living in your life. And when those things begin to show and you begin to declare them openly, by the way, you live your life in a way, not bragging, in a life that just demonstrates the power of God, but then people will come and they'll want to know, what is it exactly? And oh, what an opportunity to share in the midst of 2020, when you don't let 2020 get you down, you don't let the COVID get you down, you don't let the situation, the circumstance get you down. Those things are not going to mark your life, but it's the presence and the power of God that mark your life. Doesn't make you perfect. Didn't make David perfect. Doesn't make your circumstances perfect. David's circumstances were not perfect. But the presence of God in your life, and out will come praise, out will come thanks, out will come the victory. Will you let God mark your life today?